The worst blizzard in 50 years had been battering the high desert of northern New Mexico for 4 days when tracker Jake Crowfeather discovered what looked like a shallow grave beside the abandoned mining road. But when he started digging through the snow and frozen earth, the corpse beneath suddenly grabbed his wrist and whispered words that would send him on the most desperate rescue mission of his life. Jake Crowfeather had weathered plenty of New Mexico winters in his 38 years, but the storm that descended on the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in late February was unlike anything in living memory. The wind screamed down from the peaks with a fury that seemed almost personal, driving snow so thick he couldn't see his own hands when he held them in front of his face. The old-timers in Espanola had been talking about this storm for weeks, watching the weather patterns and shaking their heads at the satellite images that showed a massive low-pressure system building over the Colorado Rockies. When it finally hit on Monday evening, it brought with it temperatures that dropped to 20 below zero and wind gusts that reached 70 miles per hour.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
For 3 days, Jake had been holed up in his cabin near the old Esperanza mine, listening to the radio crackle with emergency broadcasts and checking on his horses through the security cameras he'd installed after losing livestock to rustlers the previous spring. The National Weather Service was calling it a historic blizzard, the kind that happened maybe once in a generation. Emergency shelters had been opened in every town from Santa Fe to Taos, and the state police were urging people to stay off the roads unless they faced a life-threatening emergency. The power had failed twice, and each time Jake had fired up the propane generator, knowing his animals depended on the heated water troughs to survive in temperatures that had dropped to 15 below zero. His nearest neighbor, an elderly rancher named Tom Begay, lived 12 miles down the mountain road, and Jake hadn't heard from him since Tuesday when the storm first hit. Tom was a tough old Navajo who'd survived everything the high desert could throw at him. But at 83, he was at an age where extended power outage or equipment failure could quickly become life-threatening. The phone lines were down, cell towers overwhelmed by the weather, and Jake's satellite internet connection flickered in and out like a dying candle. He'd tried calling Tom's landline dozens of times, but got nothing but static and the occasional busy signal that suggested the entire communication infrastructure was struggling under the storm's assault. Jake's heritage was split between two worlds. His Comanche grandmother, Alina Crowfeather, had taught him to read the land and weather patterns with skills passed down through generations of plains warriors and hunters, while his Anglo father, Robert Brennan, had passed down practical skills for surviving in modern frontier life. The combination had served Jake well in his chosen profession as a tracker and wilderness guide. At 6'2", with weathered hands and coal-black hair that he kept in a traditional braid, Jake moved through the wilderness with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that nature demanded respect, not conquest. His dark eyes held the patient intensity of a hunter, and his face bore the kind of weathered dignity that came from years spent outdoors in all kinds of weather. He made his living as a tracker and wilderness guide, helping law enforcement find missing persons and assisting hunting parties during deer season. The Rio Arriba County Sheriff's Department kept him on retainer for search and rescue operations, and he'd guided dozens of successful missions over the years. Jake had found lost hikers in the Pecos wilderness, tracked down escaped prisoners in the Badlands near Ghost Ranch, and once spent 6 days following the trail of a kidnapped child through some of the most rugged terrain in the Southwest. His reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found had spread throughout northern New Mexico, and he'd even consulted on cases as far away as Arizona and Colorado. But the storm had shut down all outside work for nearly a week, leaving him isolated with only his horses and his thoughts for company. His cabin sat on 40 acres of high desert scrubland, dotted with pinyon pines and juniper trees, that had stood since before his great-grandfather walked these same trails. The land had been in his family for 3 generations, purchased with money his grandfather earned working the copper mines before they played out in the 1960s. Jake had built the cabin himself using traditional methods combined with modern materials, thick adobe walls that held heat in winter and stayed cool in summer, solar panels that provided electricity when the grid failed, and a well that tapped into an underground spring that had never run dry. The property included a barn, equipment sheds, and horse facilities that could house up to 12 animals. Though Jake currently kept only 6 horses for his guide work, the cabin's interior reflected Jake's dual heritage Comanche artifacts, and family photographs shared space with modern conveniences and professional equipment. A traditional war shield made by his great-grandfather hung above a fireplace built from local sandstone, while GPS units and topographical maps covered a work table beneath windows that looked out toward the distant peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Range. Jake's rifle collection included both hunting weapons and family heirlooms, including a Winchester repeater that had belonged to his grandfather and a Comanche war lance that was more ceremonial than functional, but reminded him of his roots. Books on tracking, wilderness survival, and Comanche history filled shelves built from lumber salvaged from abandoned mining operations. On Thursday morning, the wind finally began to die down after 3 days of constant assault. Jake had been monitoring weather reports on his battery-powered radio, and the forecasters were cautiously optimistic that the worst was over. The temperature was still brutally cold. The thermometer outside his kitchen window read -18 degrees, but the wind had dropped from hurricane-force gusts to a more manageable 20 miles per hour. Jake pulled on his heaviest coat, a military surplus parka he'd modified with traditional beadwork and fur trim, wrapped a wool scarf around his face, and stepped outside for the first time since Monday evening. The silence was immediate and profound, broken only by the soft whisper of snow falling from pine branches and the distant cry of a hawk riding the mountain thermals. The snow came up to his thighs in most places, creating drifts that completely obscured familiar landmarks. His red pickup truck was buried under what looked like a small mountain of white powder, and the wooden fence that marked his property line had disappeared entirely beneath the accumulation. The world had been transformed into an alien landscape of smooth white curves and sharp blue shadows, beautiful but treacherous. Jake could see evidence of the storm's violence everywhere: pine trees snapped in half by the wind, power lines down, and debris scattered across his property by gusts that had reached nearly 80 miles per hour, according to the Weather Service. Reports: he spent the morning digging out his truck and checking on the horses in the nearby pasture. The animals had weathered the storm better than he'd expected, thanks to the 3-sided shelter he'd built from railroad ties and corrugated metal. Most had huddled together near the shelter, their thick winter coats providing additional protection from the cold. Jake checked each animal for signs of frostbite or injury, examining hooves, ears, and tails for the telltale white patches that indicated tissue damage. 2 horses were missing, a bay gelding named Thunder and a paint mare called Star, probably sheltering in the stand of pine trees on the far side of his property where the wind couldn't reach them. Jake made a mental note to search for them once he'd completed his initial assessment of the storm damage. As Jake counted heads and checked water supplies, he noticed something that made his tracker instincts sharpen with concern. Tire tracks cut across his land, partially filled with fresh snow, but still visible to someone who knew how to read sign. The tracks were distinct and recent, probably made during the storm or shortly after it ended. Jake knelt beside the clearest set of impressions, studying the tread pattern and measuring the width with his hands. The tracks didn't belong to any vehicle Jake recognized: too narrow for his pickup, too wide for Tom Begay's old sedan, and definitely not from any of the government vehicles that occasionally patrolled the area during hunting season or fire danger periods. The tread pattern was distinctive aggressive lugs that suggested off-road tires, probably on a vehicle designed for serious backcountry travel.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Someone had been on his property during the storm, which made no sense for several reasons. First, the mountain road had been impassable since Monday night, blocked by fallen trees and snowdrifts that would challenge even the most capable four-wheel drive vehicle. Second, there was no legitimate reason for anyone to be driving around in weather that could kill you in minutes if your vehicle broke down or got stuck. Third, the track suggested someone who knew the layout of Jake's property well enough to navigate it in near-zero visibility conditions. Jake followed the tracks as best he could, using his experience reading sign to piece together the vehicle's path across his land. The trail led from the main road toward the interior of his property, following what appeared to be a deliberate route rather than the wandering path of someone who was lost or seeking shelter. Whoever had been driving knew exactly where they were going. The tracks disappeared where the wind had swept the snow into smooth, featureless drifts, but Jake could see enough to determine that the vehicle had approached his cabin, circled around it at a distance, then headed toward the old mining roads that led deeper into the mountains. The discovery left Jake deeply uneasy. In 15 years of living alone on the mountain, he'd never had uninvited visitors during a storm. The track suggested someone desperate enough to risk their life traveling in impossible conditions, or someone with knowledge of the area that most people didn't possess. There was a third possibility that Jake didn't want to consider that someone had been using the storm as cover for activities they didn't want observed. The mountains around Esperanza had always attracted people who preferred to operate outside the law, from modern-day drug smugglers to old-fashioned cattle rustlers who took advantage of the isolation and limited law enforcement presence. By afternoon, Jake decided to attempt the drive down to check on Tom Begay. The old Navajo rancher was 83 years old and lived alone since his wife died 2 years earlier. Tom was tough as leather and knew the country better than anyone. He'd grown up on the reservation before moving to the mountains to work as a mining engineer, but the storm had been severe enough to challenge even experienced mountain dwellers. Jake was also running low on supplies and needed to make a run into town for coffee, batteries, and propane for the generator. If the county road was still impassable, he'd have to turn back, but the attempt was worth making. Jake spent an hour preparing for the journey, loading his truck with emergency supplies, checking tire chains, and filling thermos bottles with hot coffee. He packed sleeping bags, extra food, medical supplies, and tools for digging out of snowdrifts or clearing fallen trees from the road. His truck was equipped for backcountry travel, heavy-duty suspension, oversized tires, and a winch that could pull him out of most situations where he might get stuck. Jake had learned from experience that traveling in mountain winter conditions required preparation for every possible emergency, because help could be hours or days away if something went wrong. The first mile was treacherous. Jake's pickup slipped and slid despite the chains on all 4 tires, and twice he had to gun the engine to power through drifts that came halfway up his doors. The county road showed evidence of plow activity. Huge piles of snow pushed to the sides created narrow channels that were barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Jake had to back up twice to allow county maintenance trucks to pass, their drivers giving him the kind of look reserved for people who were either very brave or very stupid to be driving in these conditions. But the county road crew had been working around the clock, and the main road, while still hazardous, was passable for someone with experience driving in snow. Jake made steady progress down the mountain, his truck's heavy engine providing enough power to maintain traction even on the steepest grades. He was making good time and beginning to think he might actually make it to Tom Begay's ranch when he saw something that made him brake hard and pull over to the side of the road. What looked like a mound of disturbed earth and snow sat about 30 yards from the road, partially hidden by a cluster of juniper trees that had somehow survived the storm's assault. At first glance, Jake assumed it was just a natural formation created by wind patterns around the trees. But his tracker's eye caught details that didn't fit the pattern of natural snow accumulation. The mound was too regular, too deliberately shaped to be the result of random wind deposition. And there were marks in the snow around it, not animal tracks, which would have been quickly filled by the continuing snowfall, but the kind of disturbance that came from human activity. Jake grabbed his flashlight and emergency kit from the glove compartment, then waded through the snow toward the suspicious mound. Each step sank him knee-deep in powder, and the effort left him breathing hard in the thin mountain air. The closer he got, the more convinced he became that he was looking at something man-made. The snow had been piled deliberately, not blown by wind, and underneath he could see what looked like disturbed earth that was darker than the surrounding soil. Fresh earth, not frozen solid like it should have been after days of sub-zero temperatures. That's when he noticed the piece of red fabric protruding from one edge of the mound. Fabric that looked like it came from a winter jacket or coat, the kind of high-visibility color that serious outdoor enthusiasts wore for safety reasons. Jake's blood ran cold as he realized what he might be looking, not a natural formation, or even a cache of supplies, but a grave. Someone had been buried here, recently enough that the storm hadn't completely obscured the evidence. The implications were staggering. If this was indeed a burial site, it represented either a tragic accident or something much more sinister. Jake began digging with his hands, brushing away snow and loose dirt with growing urgency. The fabric led to more fabric, definitely. A jacket, and beneath that he could feel the unmistakable shape of a human body. His heart hammered against his ribs as he worked to uncover what he was certain would be a corpse, probably someone who had died in the storm and been hastily buried by companions, who couldn't carry the body any further. But as Jake cleared snow away from what he thought was the head area, his flashlight beam revealed something that made him freeze in shock. Dark hair, matted with ice and dirt, but beneath it was skin that looked pale rather than the blue-black color of someone who had been dead for hours or days. And when his light moved across the face, he saw lips that were chapped and bloodless, but definitely not the black color of advanced frostbite. More telling still, he could see the faintest movement of the chest beneath the snow-covered clothing. Jake pressed his ear close to the woman's mouth and caught the faintest whisper of breath. Barely detectable but definitely present. She was alive. Barely hypothermically, impossibly alive after being buried in snow and dirt for what must have been hours or even days. The medical implications were staggering. Survival in these conditions should have been impossible, which meant either she hadn't been buried as long as the evidence suggested, or she possessed an almost supernatural resistance to cold exposure. Jake immediately began digging faster, clearing snow and earth away from her shoulders and chest, checking for obvious injuries while trying to assess how long she'd been buried and what kind of medical attention she would need to have any chance of survival. As he worked, Jake could see that the woman was young, maybe early 20s, wearing clothes that had once been appropriate for winter conditions, but were now soaked through and frozen. Her dark skin suggested Hispanic heritage, and her hair was long and thick beneath the ice that had formed in it. She wore hiking boots that looked expensive and relatively new, and her jacket bore the logo of a major outdoor equipment manufacturer. This wasn't someone who had been unprepared for winter conditions. Her gear suggested experience and proper planning, which made her situation even more mysterious. She showed all the classic signs of severe hypothermia: pale skin, barely detectable pulse, breathing so shallow it was almost non-existent. Jake had seen hypothermia cases before during his search and rescue work, and he knew how critical the next few minutes would be. Hypothermia victims were incredibly fragile. Sudden movements or rapid temperature changes could trigger cardiac arrest that would kill them even after they'd survived the initial cold exposure. He needed to get her warm gradually and get her to medical help as quickly as possible. But he also needed to be careful not to cause additional trauma during the rescue process. Jake pulled off his own heavy coat and wrapped it around her. Then began the careful process of lifting her out of the shallow grave. She was small, maybe 5'4" and perhaps 120 pounds. But her body was complete dead weight, and he had to be extremely careful not to jostle her too much. Every movement had to be slow and deliberate, designed to minimize shock to her already traumatized system. As Jake lifted her, he noticed something else that made his stomach tighten, with concern marks on her wrists that looked like rope burns, suggesting that her burial might not have been the result of an accident or natural disaster. That's when her eyes fluttered open. Dark brown eyes that focused on his face with obvious difficulty. Pupils dilated and movements sluggish in the way that indicated severe neurological impairment from cold exposure. Jake leaned closer, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring, despite his own racing pulse. "You're going to be okay," he said, speaking slowly and clearly. "I'm Jake. I found you and I'm going to get you help. Can you tell me your name?" Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Jake waited patiently, knowing that hypothermia could severely affect speech and cognitive function, sometimes for hours after rescue. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke words that hit Jake like a physical blow and changed everything he thought he understood about the situation. "My sister," she gasped, her grip surprisingly strong as her fingers clutched at his shirt with desperate intensity. "Elena, she's still down there, in the mine. They left her down there to die." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back through sheer force of will, waiting for someone to find her so she could pass on this crucial information. Her eyes held a clarity that suggested these weren't the confused ramblings of someone suffering from hypothermia-induced delirium. Jake stared at her, his mind racing through the implications. If her sister was trapped in a mine somewhere in these mountains, every minute could be the difference between life and death. Underground temperatures would be somewhat warmer than surface conditions, but not warm enough to sustain life indefinitely, especially if the victim was injured or lacking proper clothing. "What mine?" he asked urgently, leaning closer to catch her fading words. "Where is she? Can you tell me which mine?" But the woman's eyes had already begun to roll back, and she was losing consciousness again, her body going limp in his arms as the effort of communicating exhausted her remaining reserves. Jake checked her pulse, still there, but weak and increasingly irregular. He had to get her to a hospital immediately, but her words echoed in his mind as he carried her toward his truck, each step a careful balance between speed and caution. Elena, still down there, in the mine. They left her down there to die. The woman's desperate message suggested that someone had deliberately trapped her sister underground, which meant this wasn't just a case of people caught in the storm or an accident involving abandoned mining equipment. This was something much more sinister, possibly kidnapping, attempted murder, or worse. And if Elena was trapped in one of the dozens of abandoned mines that dotted the mountains around Esperanza, finding her would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. The old mining district contained hundreds of shafts, tunnels, and underground workings, most of them unmapped and all of them dangerous. Many had been sealed by government agencies over the years, but plenty remained accessible to someone who knew where to look. Jake cranked the heat in his truck to maximum and wrapped the woman in every blanket and emergency supplies he had in the cab. Creating a cocoon of warmth around her hypothermic body, she drifted in and out of consciousness during the 20-minute drive to the regional medical center in Espanola, sometimes mumbling words he couldn't understand, sometimes calling out names in what sounded like Spanish. Once she grabbed his arm with surprising strength and said clearly, "The old Spanish mine." They took her to the old Spanish mine. Elena is in the old Spanish mine. Then she slipped back into unconsciousness, her breathing becoming even more shallow and irregular. Jake pressed harder on the accelerator, knowing that every minute of delay decreased her chances of survival and potentially doomed her sister to a terrible death underground. Dr. Amanda Reyes met them at the emergency room entrance of Espanola Regional Medical Center, her scrubs bearing the evidence of a long shift dealing with storm-related emergencies. She was young, maybe 32, but moved with the confidence of someone who'd handled plenty of cold weather trauma cases during her 3 years at the mountain hospital. The moment she saw the woman in Jake's arms, her training kicked in, and she began barking orders to the nursing staff. Get me a warming blanket, cardiac monitor, and 4 setup stat. This is severe hypothermia, and we're looking at potential cardiac arrest if we're not careful. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she helped transfer the woman to a gurney. Core body temperature is 89 degrees, she announced after her initial examination, the digital thermometer displaying numbers that would have been fatal. For most people, we need to warm her gradually using controlled rewarming protocols. Any rapid temperature change could send her into ventricular fibrillation. Jake watched as the medical team surrounded the woman, attaching monitors in 4 lines with the choreographed precision of professionals who performed these procedures hundreds of times. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room, its rhythm irregular but present. How long was she exposed? Dr. Reyes asked as she checked the woman's pupils for neurological damage. Jake explained how he'd found her buried in the snow, describing the location and the apparent deliberate nature of the burial, but he intentionally left out the part about her sister for the moment. He wanted to hear what the medical team thought about her condition before introducing what might be dismissed as hypothermic hallucinations. Mr. Crow Feather, Dr. Reyes said after completing her neurological assessment, I need you to understand something important. This woman has been experiencing severe hypothermia, which can cause significant cognitive impairment. Patients in her condition often suffer from confusion, false memories, and elaborate paranoid delusions. They might imagine conversations with people who aren't there, create detailed scenarios about being chased or threatened, or believe that family members are in danger when they're actually safe. It's a well-documented medical phenomenon that can persist for hours or even days. After rescue, I wouldn't put too much stock in anything she might have said during transport. But Jake's years of experience reading people told him that what he'd witnessed wasn't medical delirium. The woman's eyes had held a clarity and desperation that spoke of genuine terror, not confused rambling. Her mention of specific details, Elena, the mine, the people who had left her sister to die suggested memories, too coherent to be hypothermic hallucinations. Sheriff Miguel Sandoval arrived an hour later, stamping snow off his boots and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else than dealing with another emergency during the worst storm in recent memory. At 58, Sandoval had been sheriff of Rio Arriba County for 12 years, and his weathered face bore the marks of someone who'd seen every kind of human tragedy the high desert could produce. Jake had worked with him on dozens of search and rescue operations, and the two men had developed a mutual respect based on shared experiences, tracking down missing persons in some of the most unforgiving terrain in the Southwest. Jake, Sandoval said, accepting a cup of coffee from the nurse and settling his large frame into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs that seemed to be standard equipment in every hospital waiting room. Dispatcher said you found someone buried in the snow up on the mountain road. Hell of a thing. We've had 4 accidents since Tuesday, couple of fender benders, one rollover that could have been fatal if the driver hadn't been wearing his seatbelt, and a semi that jackknifed near the Espanola exit. But this is the first one where someone was found actually buried. You said she mentioned something about a sister? Jake repeated what the woman had told him about Elena being trapped in a mine, about being left there to die by unnamed assailants. He described the specific mention of the old Spanish mine, and the urgency in her voice when she'd spoken about her sister's plight. The sheriff listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes in the small notebook he always carried. His expression growing more serious as Jake laid out the details. When Jake finished, Sandoval was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the snow that continued to fall despite the weather. Service's optimistic predictions about the storm's end. The old Spanish mine, Sandoval mused, rolling the phrase around like he was tasting something bitter. That could be any of a dozen locations around here, maybe more. Spanish miners worked these mountains for over 200 years, before the American mining companies moved in during the territorial period. Most of those old workings are completely unmapped, unstable as hell, and scattered across hundreds of square miles of backcountry. If someone really is trapped down there, we've got a serious problem that goes way beyond a simple rescue operation. But Jake could hear the skepticism in the sheriff's voice, the tone of someone who'd heard too many false alarms and wild stories over the years. Miguel, Jake said, using the sheriff's first name to emphasize the seriousness of his concerns. I've been doing search and rescue in these mountains for 15 years. I know the difference between someone who's confused and someone who's desperate to save a life. This woman wasn't hallucinating when she talked about her sister. She was lucid, specific, and terrified. If there's even a chance that someone named Elena is trapped in one of those mines, we have to at least try to find her. Sandoval sighed and looked out at the storm, clearly weighing the risks of launching a search operation in impossible weather conditions against the possibility that an innocent person was dying underground. Dr. Reyes emerged from the treatment room 40 minutes later, pulling off her latex gloves and looking cautiously optimistic. She's stable for now, but still critical. Her core temperature is up to 92 degrees, which is progress, but we're not out of the woods yet. The warming process has to be gradual, or we risk triggering cardiac complications that could kill her even after she's survived the hypothermia. It'll be several more hours before she's conscious enough for detailed questioning, and even then, her memories might be fragmented or unreliable. She paused, glancing between Jake and the sheriff. Any identification? Driver's license, credit cards, anything that might tell us who she is? Sandoval shook his head grimly. Nothing. No purse, no wallet, no phone, no jewelry except for a small silver cross on a chain around her neck. Whoever she is, she wasn't carrying anything when Mr. Crowfeather found her. Her clothing is good quality expensive hiking boots, name brand. Winter jacket, thermal underwear that suggests she knew what she was doing in winter conditions. But there are no labels, no monogramming, nothing that would help us identify her or figure out where she came from. The absence of identification was troubling, suggesting either that the woman had been deliberately stripped of anything that might reveal her identity, or that she'd been trying to travel anonymously for reasons of her own. Jake thought about the tire tracks he'd found on his property, about the timing of the storm, about the terror in the woman's voice when she'd mentioned her sister. Pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a pattern that he didn't like. Someone had used the storm as cover for activities they didn't want observed. Activities that had resulted in at least one woman being buried alive and another possibly trapped underground. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that they were dealing with something far more serious than people caught unprepared by bad weather. Sheriff, Jake said, what if this isn't about people getting lost in the storm? What if someone used the blizzard to cover up a crime? Think about it, perfect weather for making people disappear. No witnesses, no way for law enforcement to respond quickly. If you wanted to get rid of someone and make it look like an accident, this storm would provide ideal conditions. Sandoval's expression grew darker as he considered the implications. In his 12 years as sheriff, he'd seen plenty of crimes that took advantage of the isolation and harsh conditions of the high desert. But using a natural disaster as cover for kidnapping or murder suggested a level of planning and ruthlessness that was genuinely disturbing. If you're right, Sandoval said slowly, then we're not just looking at a rescue operation. We're potentially dealing with kidnapping, attempted murder, maybe worse. And if there really is someone trapped in one of those mines, the perpetrators might be counting on the weather to eliminate their victim for them. No body, no evidence, no investigation. The sheriff stood up and began pacing, his mind clearly working through the tactical and logistical challenges of launching a criminal investigation during a major natural disaster. Jake, I need you to think carefully about everything you observed at the burial site. Any details that might help us understand what happened there. Evidence of multiple people, tire tracks, anything that might tell us how many individuals we're dealing with or what kind of vehicle they were using. Jake closed his eyes and mentally revisited the scene, using his tracker's training to recall details that might have seemed insignificant at the time. The burial was hasty but not random, he said finally. Someone took time to pile the snow and dirt in a way that would look natural from a distance, but they were working fast. The dirt underneath wasn't frozen solid, which means it was disturbed. Recently, probably within the last 24 hours. And there were marks in the snow around the site that suggested at least 2 people, maybe 3, boot prints that were mostly filled in by the continuing snowfall, but enough definition left to suggest different sizes and tread patterns. Jake paused, remembering something else that had bothered him at the time. The woman's position in the grave. She wasn't just dumped there. Someone arranged her carefully, almost like they wanted to give her the best possible chance of survival. If they really intended to kill her, why not bury her deeper or choose a location where she'd never be found? The question hung in the air between them, suggesting possibilities that were both hopeful and deeply troubling. Before Sandoval could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the treatment room. Voices were raised, equipment was being moved rapidly, and Jake could hear Dr. Reyes calling for additional medication. The 3 men rushed toward the source of the disturbance, arriving at the treatment room just as the woman began to regain consciousness. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lighting, and her lips moved as she tried to speak. Dr. Reyes leaned over her, speaking in soothing tones while monitoring her vital signs on the various machines that surrounded the bed. "Take it easy," the doctor said gently. "You're in the hospital. You're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" The woman's eyes moved around the room, taking in the medical equipment and unfamiliar faces before settling on Jake's face with obvious recognition. "You," she whispered, her voice stronger than it had been during the rescue, but still weak and strained. "You found me. Thank God you found me." She tried to sit up, but Dr. Reyes gently but firmly pressed her back against the pillows. "My sister," the woman continued, her voice growing more urgent. "Elena, did you find Elena? Please tell me you found her. You have to understand, they took both of us. They separated us. They buried me, but they took Elena somewhere else, somewhere underground. She's still alive. I know she's still alive, but she won't last much longer. Without help." The coherence and specificity of her statements caused Dr. Reyes to exchange glances with Sheriff Sandoval. This didn't sound like hypothermic delirium. This sounded like someone desperately trying to save a life. "What's your name?" Sandoval asked, stepping closer to the bed. "Who are you, and who took you?" The woman looked at him with eyes that held a mixture of hope and terror. "Maria," she said clearly. "Maria Santos. My sister is Elena Santos. We're from Las Cruces. We came up here looking for work, following rumors about jobs at one of the mining operations, but it was a trap. The men who hired us, they weren't interested in our work skills." Her voice broke slightly as she continued. "They separated us 2 days ago. I don't know why they buried me instead of killing me outright, but they took Elena to one of the old mines. I heard them talking about it before they knocked me unconscious. They said something about the old Spanish workings, about a place where no one would ever find her, about letting the mountain take care of their problem for them." The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. This wasn't a case of people caught unprepared by bad weather. This was evidence of a human trafficking operation that was using the isolation of the mining district to commit crimes. That would normally be impossible in more populated areas. "Maria," Jake said, stepping closer to her bed, "can you remember anything specific about the location where they took Elena? Any landmarks, distances, anything that might help us find her?" Maria closed her eyes, clearly struggling to organize. "Memories that were fragmented by trauma and hypothermia. They drove for maybe 20 minutes after they separated us," she said slowly, "up into the mountains, on roads that weren't paved. I could hear the engine working hard, like we were climbing. Steep grades. And there was a sound like metal clanging against metal that kept getting louder as we got closer to wherever they were taking her. When they stopped, I could see an old building, maybe a mill or processing plant from the mining days. But they kept Elena in the vehicle and drove toward what looked like a hole in the mountainside, a tunnel entrance with wooden supports that looked old and rotted. I could hear her screaming my name as they drove away with her." Maria's voice broke entirely at this point, and tears began streaming down her face. "She's diabetic," she whispered. "Elena is diabetic and she needs her insulin. Without her medication, she'd go into shock and die. Even if the cold doesn't kill her, the diabetes will. Please, you have to find her. She's only 19 years old and she's all the family I have left." The desperation in her voice was heartbreaking, but it also provided crucial information that might help narrow the search. Sheriff Sandoval was already reaching for his radio, calling for backup and beginning to organize what would obviously need to be a major search and rescue operation. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Sandoval. I need you to contact state police and request assistance for a possible kidnapping and human trafficking case in the mining district. We have one victim recovered and another potentially trapped underground. I also need you to reach out to the county emergency coordinator and see if we can get access to any maps or records of Spanish-era mining operations in the area north of Esperanza." The radio crackled with static as the dispatcher acknowledged his requests. Dr. Reyes checked Maria's vital signs again, clearly concerned about the stress that talking about her sister's situation was placing on her already traumatized system. "Sheriff, I need to limit questioning for now. Her body is still recovering from severe hypothermia, and emotional stress could trigger cardiac complications. Can you give me another hour to stabilize her condition before continuing the interview?" But Maria grabbed the doctor's arm with surprising strength, her eyes blazing with determination despite her physical weakness. "No," she said firmly. "Elena doesn't have another hour. Every minute we waste here is a minute closer to her death. I'll answer any questions you have, give you any information that might help, but please don't make me wait while my sister dies underground." The raw emotion in her voice was impossible to ignore, and even Dr. Reyes seemed moved by the young woman's desperation to save her sister. "All right," the doctor said finally, "but I'm monitoring your heart rate and blood pressure. If either one spikes too high, we stop immediately." Jake pulled out a topographical map of the area that he always carried in his vehicle, spreading it across the bedside table where Maria could see it. "Maria, can you show me approximately where you think they took Elena? Any details you remember about the route or the terrain might help us narrow down the search area." Maria studied the map with obvious difficulty, her vision still affected by the hypothermia and the trauma she'd endured. "Here," she said finally, pointing to an area roughly 10 miles northeast of where Jake had found her. It was definitely uphill from where they buried me, and the road was rough, like it hadn't been maintained in years. The building I saw looked like it was from the old mining days stone walls, metal roof that was mostly rusted away, and the tunnel entrance was maybe 100 yards from the building, cut directly into the rock face of the mountain. Jake studied the area she'd indicated, mentally cataloging what he knew about the old mining operations in that region. There were indeed several Spanish-era mines in that vicinity, most of them abandoned for decades and all of them potentially lethal. To anyone trapped inside without proper equipment or knowledge of underground conditions. How many men were there? Sandoval asked. Can you describe them or their vehicle? Maria's face darkened as she recalled her captors. 3 men, all Hispanic, probably Mexican from their accents. The leader was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and a scar across his left cheek. The other 2 were younger, more like hired muscle than people making decisions. They were driving a large SUV, black or dark blue, with tinted windows and off-road tires. New Mexico plates, but I couldn't see the numbers. She paused, clearly struggling with painful memories. They weren't just random criminals. They knew the area well, talked about the mines like they'd used them before for this kind of thing. I think Elena and I weren't their first victims. They mentioned something about the others and how the mountains had a way of keeping secrets permanently. The implications were chilling. This wasn't an isolated incident, but potentially part of a larger criminal operation that had been using the remote mining district to dispose of victims for an extended period. Jake felt his anger building as he realized that predators had been using his beloved mountains as a hunting ground, taking advantage of the isolation and harsh conditions to commit crimes that would be impossible in more populated areas. Sheriff, Jake said, his voice tight. With controlled fury, we need to move fast. If Maria is right about Elena being diabetic, we're looking at a very short window for rescue. Diabetic shock can kill in hours, especially under stressful conditions. And if these men have been using the mines for previous crimes, Elena might not be the only person who needs rescue. Sandoval nodded grimly, already coordinating with state police and emergency services to organize the largest search operation in the county's recent history. But outside, the storm continued to rage, making helicopter support impossible and limiting ground operations to the most experienced and well-equipped teams. The race to save Elena Santos had begun, but it would require everything Jake knew about the mountains, everything the sheriff's department could mobilize in terms of resources, and a significant amount of luck to succeed. As medical equipment beeped around Maria's bed and radio traffic filled the air with urgent coordination efforts, Jake studied the map and began planning an approach to the old Spanish mines that might represent Elena's only chance of survival. Time was running out, and somewhere in the vast network of underground tunnels that honeycombed the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, a 19-year-old diabetic was fighting for her life. The storm had intensified again by the time Jake and Sheriff Sandoval left the hospital, with wind gusts reaching 60 miles per hour and visibility dropping to near zero. The Weather Service was now calling it a historic blizzard that would be remembered for decades, but Jake knew they couldn't wait for conditions to improve. Elena Santos had been missing for over 48 hours, and if Maria was right about her sister's diabetic condition, they were already operating on borrowed time. The sheriff's department had mobilized every available resource, but the brutal conditions meant that only the most experienced mountain rescue personnel could attempt the search. Jake's truck was equipped with everything needed for extended backcountry operations, emergency medical supplies, climbing gear, underground rescue equipment, and enough food and water for several days. He'd also loaded specialized equipment that most people never saw. Thermal imaging cameras for detecting body heat in dark spaces, gas detectors for monitoring underground air quality, and communication devices that could penetrate rock formations to maintain contact with surface teams. His years of search and rescue work had taught him that preparation often meant the difference between bringing someone home alive or recovering a body. Sheriff Sandoval rode with Jake, coordinating with state police and federal agencies through encrypted radio channels. The FBI had taken interest in the case once human trafficking allegations emerged, and agents from the Albuquerque field office were driving north despite the weather. "This is bigger than we initially thought," Sandoval said, adjusting his radio. As they climbed into the mountains, We ran the descriptions Maria gave us to federal databases and got hits on similar operations in Arizona, Colorado, and Texas. There's a pattern here: remote mining areas being used to hold victims before they're moved across international borders. The operation we're dealing with isn't just local criminals taking advantage of isolated women. This appears to be part of a sophisticated trafficking network that's been operating throughout the Southwest for at least 2 years. Jake absorbed this information while navigating treacherous mountain roads that were barely passable even with chains and four-wheel drive. The windshield wipers struggled against the heavy snow, and visibility was so poor that he had to rely on GPS navigation and his intimate knowledge of the terrain to stay on course. "How many victims are we talking about?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "Conservative estimate based on missing person reports and witness statements. Maybe 30 to 40 women over the past 18 months. Most of them young Hispanic females who were targeted while looking for work or trying to cross the border. The pattern is always the same. They're approached with promises of legitimate employment, then taken to remote locations where they're held until they can be transported to buyers in major cities or across international borders." Sandoval's voice was grim as he continued. "The fact that Alina was taken to a mine instead of being killed outright suggests she might be valuable to them for some reason, but it also means we might not be the only people looking for her. If this trafficking ring has invested time and effort in keeping Elena alive, they'll probably send people to retrieve her once the storm passes." This added another layer of urgency to the rescue operation. Not only were they racing against Elena's medical condition and the brutal weather, but they might also be competing against armed criminals who had their own reasons for wanting to reach her first. Jake pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his truck through snowdrifts that would have stopped most vehicles, while Sandoval continued coordinating with other agencies through increasingly crackling radio communications. The area Maria had indicated on the map was accessible by only 2 routes: a main mining road that had been partially maintained by the Forest Service, and an older track that followed ridgelines and was barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Jake chose the ridge route because it offered better visibility and multiple escape paths if they encountered the trafficking operation security personnel. The road was treacherous, winding through stands of aspen and pine that were heavy with snow, but Jake's truck handled the conditions with the confidence that came from years of backcountry modifications and maintenance. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape became increasingly desolate and beautiful. Snow-covered peaks stretched to the horizon, and the silence was broken only by the wind and the steady rumble of the truck's engine. This was country that hadn't changed much since Jake's Comanche ancestors rode these same ridges, hunting elk and trading with Spanish settlers, who were just beginning to explore the mineral wealth hidden beneath the mountains. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that the same isolation his people had used for protection was now being exploited by criminals who preyed on the vulnerable. 20 minutes into the drive, Jake's thermal imaging equipment detected heat signatures ahead that didn't match natural wildlife patterns. He pulled over and glassed the area through high-powered binoculars, studying the terrain for signs of human activity. What he saw made his pulse quicken. Tire tracks in the snow leading toward a cluster of old mining buildings, and wisps of smoke rising from what looked like a makeshift camp. "We've got company," he told Sandoval, handing over the binoculars. "Looks like someone's been using the old Esperanza processing plant as a base of operations. Multiple vehicles, probably 4 or 5 people based on the heat signatures, and they've got some kind of heating system running." Sandoval studied the scene through the binoculars, his expression growing darker as he took in the tactical situation. "This isn't just a rescue operation anymore. We're looking at a potential armed confrontation with people who have everything to lose if they're captured. I need to call for backup, but with the storm conditions, we might be on our own for several hours." The sheriff reached for his radio, but Jake caught his arm before he could transmit. "Miguel, If Elena is down in one of those mines and these people realize law enforcement is closing in, what do you think they'll do to eliminate evidence? The question hung between them, both men understanding the implications. If the trafficking operation felt threatened, they might decide to seal the mine entrances permanently, effectively burying any evidence of their crimes along with any victims who might still be alive underground. We need to get to Elena before they know we're here, Jake continued. Once we have her safely out of the mine, then we call for backup and deal with the criminals. But if we approach this like a traditional law enforcement operation, we might be signing her death warrant. Sandoval was quiet for several minutes, weighing the risks of proceeding without backup against the possibility of losing their only chance to save Elena Santos. Finally, he nodded grimly. All right, Jake, we do this quiet and fast. But the moment we have Elena out of that mine, we call in everything: state police, FBI, National Guard, if necessary. These people aren't going to escape to victimize anyone else. The decision made, they began planning their approach to the mining complex. Jake's knowledge of the old Esperanza operation was extensive. He'd explored the area numerous times during his youth, and his grandfather had actually worked in some of the deeper shafts during the 1950s before the copper played out. The complex consisted of 3 main buildings: a processing mill where ore had been crushed and refined, a maintenance shop for equipment repair, and an administrative building that had housed the mine offices. The actual mine entrances were scattered across the mountainside, connected by a network of access roads that were now barely visible under decades of vegetation growth. The Spanish workings Maria mentioned are probably the old San Miguel shafts, Jake explained as they studied topographical maps. They're about half a mile up the mountain from the main processing plant, accessible by a switchback road that was cut into the rock face sometime in the 1800s. The shafts go down at least 200 feet, maybe deeper, and they connect to a network of tunnels that honeycombs this entire mountainside. If Elena's down there, finding her is going to be like searching a 3-dimensional maze in the dark. The technical challenges were daunting, but Jake had experience with underground rescue operations. More concerning was the condition they might find Elena in after 2 days underground in winter conditions. Even if the mine shafts provided some protection from surface weather, temperatures underground would still be well below freezing, and the air quality could be dangerous from accumulated gases or simple oxygen depletion. Add her diabetic condition to the equation, and they were looking at a victim who might be unconscious or in medical crisis, even if they found her quickly. We'll need medical supplies for diabetic shock, Jake told Sandoval. Glucose gel, insulin if we can get it, warming blankets, and probably 4 fluids. I've got basic medical training from my search and rescue certification, but we might need to stabilize her underground before we can attempt to bring her to the surface. Sandoval was already on his radio, coordinating with the hospital to have Dr. Reyes prepare emergency medical supplies that could be delivered to their location. The logistics were complicated by the storm conditions and the need to maintain operational security, but the sheriff's department had protocols for dealing with remote medical emergencies that would serve them well in this situation. As they approached the mining complex, Jake cut the engine and let the truck coast to a stop behind a stand of pine trees that provided concealment from the main buildings. Through binoculars they could see clear evidence of recent activity: fresh tire tracks in the snow, lights in the windows of the maintenance building, and at least 2 vehicles parked near what had once been the main entrance to the processing plant. The setup looked professional and well organized, suggesting that this wasn't a temporary operation, but an established base that had been in use for some time. 3 vehicles that I can see, Sandoval whispered, scanning the area through his own binoculars. Black SUV that matches Maria's description, a pickup truck with a snow plow attachment, and what looks like a delivery van. My guess is they used the van to transport victims and the pickup to maintain access roads during winter operations. The SUV is probably for security and quick response. Jake was studying the mountain face above the buildings, looking for the access road that would lead to the old Spanish mine shafts. There it was, a narrow track that zigzagged up the steep slope, barely visible under the snow but still passable for someone with experience driving in mountain conditions. I can get us up to the mine entrances without being seen from the main buildings, Jake said, pointing out the route. The access road follows a natural depression in the mountainside that will keep us hidden until we're almost at the shaft openings. But once we start the ascent, we'll be committed. There's no turning around on that road, and if they spot us, we'll be trapped with nowhere to run except deeper into the mine system. The tactical situation was far from ideal, but they had surprise on their side, and Jake's intimate knowledge of the terrain gave them advantages that the trafficking operation couldn't match. Sandoval checked his weapon and radio equipment one final time, then looked at Jake with the expression of someone who'd made peace with a dangerous decision. All right, partner, let's go get Elena Santos. They transferred essential equipment to Jake's backpack: medical supplies, communication gear, climbing ropes, and emergency lighting. Jake also grabbed his grandfather's old mining helmet, a battered hard hat that had seen decades of underground work and still bore, the carbide lamp mount that had provided illumination in the days before electric lighting became standard. The drive up the access road required every bit of Jake's driving skill and his truck's four-wheel drive capability. The track was barely wide enough for a single vehicle, with steep drop-offs on one side and sheer rock walls on the other. Snow had filled the road in several places, creating drifts that had to be powered through rather than driven around. Twice, they had to stop and dig by hand, clearing snow from the path while listening for any sounds that might indicate they'd been discovered by the people at the main complex below. After 30 minutes of careful driving, they reached the plateau, where the San Miguel mine entrances had been cut into the mountainside over a century earlier. The openings were partially concealed by wooden structures that had been built to protect the shafts from weather and rockfall, but Jake could see that the barriers had been recently disturbed. Fresh tool marks in the wood and new hardware suggested that someone had been working to make the entrances accessible again. This is it, he told Sandoval as they parked the truck behind a boulder that would hide it from casual observation. The main shaft goes straight down about 50 feet, then angles off into the mountain following the ore veins. The Spanish miners were following silver deposits, so the tunnel system follows the natural geology rather than any logical pattern. It's easy to get lost down there, even with modern equipment. Jake had explored parts of the San Miguel system during his teenage years, but he'd never penetrated deeply into the network because of the obvious dangers. Cave-ins, toxic gases, and simple disorientation had killed plenty of miners over the caverns. Centuries, and those hazards hadn't diminished with time. As they approached the main shaft entrance, Jake's flashlight beam revealed something that made his heart race: fresh footprints in the snow leading directly to the mine opening, and rope marks on the wooden framework that suggested someone had been lowered into the shaft recently. Elena's down there, he said with certainty. The question is whether she's still alive, and whether we can get her out before the traffickers realize what we're doing. Sandoval was already setting up communication equipment that would allow them to stay in contact with surface teams, while Jake prepared the climbing gear they'd need to descend safely into the mine. The shaft opening was roughly 8 feet square, lined with timbers that had been cut from local pine trees sometime in the 1800s. The wood was weathered but still structurally sound, and Jake could see that someone had recently reinforced the supports with modern materials. A rope hung down into the darkness, disappearing beyond the reach of their flashlight beams. Whoever brought Elena down here knew what they were doing, Jake observed. This isn't amateur work. They've modified the shaft for safe access and they've taken precautions to prevent collapse. which suggests they're planning to use this location again. The professional nature of the setup was both encouraging and deeply disturbing. It meant Elena had probably been lowered into the mine safely, but it also confirmed that this was an established operation that had been running for some time. How many other victims had been brought to this same location? And what had happened to them after the traffickers were finished with whatever purpose the mine served in their operation? These questions would have to wait. Their immediate priority was finding Elena Santos and getting her medical attention before her diabetic condition killed her. Jake secured the climbing rope around his waist and tested the ancient wooden framework one final time before beginning his descent into the San Miguel mine shaft. The rope that the traffickers had left behind was sturdy climbing-grade equipment, but Jake didn't trust gear that might have been tampered with or sabotaged. Sheriff Sandoval remained at the surface, monitoring radio communications and serving as backup in case the criminal operation discovered their rescue attempt. The plan was simple. Jake would descend, locate Elena Santos, assess her medical condition, and signal for extraction equipment if she couldn't climb out under her own power. The shaft dropped straight down for the first 40 feet through solid rock that had been hand-carved by Spanish miners over 2 centuries ago. Jake's headlamp illuminated tool marks in the stone walls where men with nothing but hammers and chisels had carved a passage into the mountain, following silver veins that had made fortunes for some and graves for others. The air was noticeably warmer as he descended, protected from the surface blizzard, but still cold enough to be dangerous for someone without proper clothing. At the bottom of the vertical shaft, the mine opened into a horizontal tunnel system that branched off in 3 directions. Jake's boots touched solid ground after what felt like an eternity, but had probably been less than 2 minutes. He unclipped from the descent rope and immediately began checking air quality with the electronic monitors he'd brought from his search and rescue kit. Oxygen levels were acceptable, but not ideal, and there were trace amounts of methane and carbon dioxide that could become dangerous in deeper areas of the mine. His radio crackled with static as he tried to contact Sandoval, but the rock formation was blocking most communication signals. They'd planned for this contingency. If Jake wasn't back to the surface within 2 hours, the sheriff would call for full emergency backup regardless of operational security concerns. The tunnel system ahead of him was more extensive than Jake had remembered from his teenage explorations. The main passage ran roughly east-west, following what had probably been the primary silver vein, while smaller side tunnels branched off at irregular intervals. Some of these passages had been blocked by rockfall or deliberately sealed, but others showed signs of recent disturbance. Jake chose the main tunnel because it was the most likely route for someone carrying an unconscious or semi-conscious victim, and because his grandfather had once told him that the Spanish miners always built their deepest chambers along the primary ore veins where the work was most profitable. 50 yards into the tunnel, Jake found the first evidence that Elena Santos was somewhere in this underground maze. A piece of torn fabric caught on a wooden support beam matched the description of the clothing Maria had said her sister was wearing when they were separated. The fabric was recent, not weathered or faded like material that had been underground for months or years. Jake carefully removed the cloth and continued deeper into the mine, following the main passage while noting side tunnels that he might need to explore if the primary route didn't yield results. The tunnel began to slope downward more steeply, and Jake could hear the sound of water dripping somewhere ahead. This was both encouraging and worrisome. The presence of water suggested that deeper areas of the mine might have better air circulation, but it also meant potential flooding or unstable ground conditions that could make rescue operations extremely dangerous. Jake's headlamp illuminated another branching point where the main tunnel split into 2 equally sized passages. He paused here, listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate human presence. That's when he heard it, a faint sound that might have been someone moaning or calling for help. The sound was coming from the left-hand tunnel, which appeared to slope more gently downward and showed more evidence of recent foot traffic. Jake marked his route with reflective tape before proceeding, knowing that getting lost in the mine system would turn a rescue operation into a double fatality. Sound came again, definitely human and definitely distressed. Elena Santos was somewhere ahead of him in the darkness, probably in serious medical condition after 2 days underground without insulin or proper protection from the cold. The left tunnel opened into a natural cavern that had been expanded by mining operations, creating a large underground chamber with multiple passages leading off in different directions. Jake's headlamp beam swept across the space, revealing evidence of recent habitation: sleeping bags, camping equipment, and supplies that suggested this underground location had been used as a temporary holding facility for multiple people over an extended period. The implications were chilling. How many victims had been brought to this underground prison before being transported to their final destinations? But Jake's attention was immediately drawn to a figure huddled against the far wall of the chamber. A young woman, matching Maria's description of her sister, was wrapped in a blanket and appeared to be barely conscious. Jake approached carefully, speaking in soothing tones to avoid startling someone who was probably terrified and disoriented. Elena Santos? My name is Jake. Your sister Maria sent me to find you. You're going to be okay. The woman's head lifted slowly, and Jake could see that she was indeed young, probably in her late teens, with dark hair and features that marked her as Maria's sister. Elena's condition was worse than Jake had hoped, but better than he'd feared. She was conscious and responsive, though clearly suffering from hypothermia, dehydration, and what were probably the early stages of diabetic ketoacidosis. Her speech was slurred and her movements uncoordinated, but she was able to communicate and seemed to understand that rescue had arrived. "Maria," she whispered, trying to sit up straighter. "Is Maria okay? They said they killed her. They said they buried her and left her to freeze." Jake felt a surge of relief. Elena was coherent enough to provide information about her captors and her medical condition. "Maria is alive and safe," Jake assured her, beginning his medical assessment. While talking, "She's the one who told us where to find you. We need to get you out of here and to a hospital. But first I need to know about your diabetes. When did you last have insulin? Do you have any medication with you?" Elena shook her head weakly. "They took everything. My purse, my medication, everything. I haven't had insulin in 2 days. I can feel myself getting sicker. My blood sugar must be really high by now." Jake had brought emergency glucose gel and basic diabetic supplies, but Elena's condition required professional medical intervention. That could only be provided at a hospital. As Jake prepared Elena for transport, he heard something that made his blood freeze, voices echoing through the tunnel system, getting closer. The trafficking operation had discovered their rescue attempt, and armed men were now heading toward the underground chamber where Elena had been held. Jake's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Sheriff Sandoval. "Jake, get out of there now. 3 men with weapons just went down into the mine. They know you're down there, and they're not planning to let either of you come back up alive. I'm calling for backup, but you need to find another way out." Jake looked around the chamber desperately, his headlamp beam revealing multiple tunnel openings that might lead to other exits or might dead-end in collapsed passages that would trap them underground permanently. Elena was in no condition for a dangerous escape through unknown mine workings, but staying in the chamber meant certain death when the armed traffickers arrived. The voices were getting closer, and Jake could see flashlight beams beginning to illuminate the tunnel entrance they'd have to pass through to reach the main shaft. "Elena, can you walk?" Jake asked urgently, helping her to her feet. "We need to move right now." She nodded weakly, leaning heavily on his arm, but able to support some of her own weight. Jake chose the tunnel that seemed to slope upward, hoping it might lead to another surface exit or at least to a defensible position where they could hold out until backup arrived. The passage was narrow and partially blocked by fallen rocks, forcing them to crawl in some sections, while Jake tried to support Elena's weakening body and navigate, using only the limited illumination from his headlamp. Behind them, the voices in the main chamber were getting louder and more agitated. Jake could hear Spanish curses and angry discussions about how rescue personnel had found their operation. "Spread out and check every tunnel," someone shouted in accented English. "They can't have gone far, and the girl is too sick to move quickly. Find them and eliminate them both. We can't afford to have witnesses who can identify this location." The cold-blooded nature of the orders sent chills through Jake that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. The tunnel they'd chosen began to branch into multiple smaller passages, creating a maze that would be difficult to navigate even under ideal conditions. Jake had to make quick decisions about which route to follow, guided only by air currents that might indicate connections to surface openings and his intuitive understanding of how Spanish miners would have designed their tunnel systems. Elena was struggling to keep up, her diabetic condition making physical exertion increasingly difficult. But she didn't complain and seemed to understand that their lives depended on staying ahead of their pursuers. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Jake's headlamp illuminated something that gave him hope: rough wooden stairs, leading upward toward what looked like another vertical shaft. This could be a secondary exit from the mine system, possibly one that the traffickers didn't know about or hadn't bothered to guard. Jake helped Elena up the stairs, both of them breathing hard from exertion and stress. At the top of the stairs, they found themselves in another vertical shaft, this one narrower than the main entrance, but definitely leading upward toward what Jake hoped was the surface. The shaft was equipped with old mining equipment, a primitive elevator system using pulleys and cables that had probably been installed in the early 1900s, when the mining operation was mechanized. The equipment looked dangerous and unreliable, but it might be their only chance to reach the surface without confronting the armed traffickers who were searching the lower tunnel system. Jake tested the cables and pulleys carefully, trying to determine if they could support the weight of two people ascending together. The wooden platform was small and showed signs of age and weather damage, but it appeared structurally sound enough for a desperate escape attempt. Elena collapsed against the shaft wall, her breathing becoming more labored as her diabetic condition continued to deteriorate. "I don't think I can make it much further," she whispered. "My blood sugar is so high I can barely think straight. Maybe you should go ahead and bring back help." But Jake wasn't about to abandon Elena Santos after coming this far. He'd made a promise to Maria that he would bring her sister home alive, and he intended to keep that promise regardless of the personal risk involved. Besides, leaving Elena alone in the mine shaft would almost certainly mean her death, either from her medical condition or from the traffickers who were still searching for them. Jake rigged a safety harness for Elena using climbing rope from his rescue kit, then began the delicate process of operating the old mining equipment to lift them toward what he hoped was the surface. The pulleys squeaked and groaned under their weight, and the wooden platform swayed alarmingly as they slowly ascended through the narrow shaft. Elena had lost consciousness, her body unable to cope with the stress of escape combined with her deteriorating diabetic condition. Jake monitored her pulse and breathing while operating the elevator mechanism with one hand, praying that they would reach the surface before either the equipment failed or Elena went into complete diabetic shock. Halfway up the shaft, Jake heard sounds of pursuit from below. The traffickers had found the secondary passage and were beginning to ascend the wooden stairs. Flashlight beams probed upward through the darkness, and Jake could hear angry voices discussing how to reach the elevator platform. Someone was testing the equipment from below, trying to determine if they could override Jake's control of the system. Time was running out. If the traffickers gained control of the elevator, they could either trap Jake and Elena in the shaft, or send them plummeting to their deaths on the rocks below. The platform lurched suddenly as someone below began interfering with the pulley system. Jake looked up desperately, trying to estimate how much farther they had to go to reach the surface. His headlamp illuminated what looked like a wooden cover over the shaft opening, probably installed to prevent people or animals from accidentally falling into the mine. If the cover was locked or too heavy to move, they would be trapped in the shaft with armed criminals below and no way to escape above. Elena stirred weakly, her eyes opening for a moment, before rolling back as her body continued to shut down. From diabetic ketoacidosis, Jake made a desperate decision. Using his feet to brace against the shaft walls, he pushed the wooden platform upward with all his strength while simultaneously trying to operate the pulley system. The platform rose another 10 feet, bringing them within reach of the shaft. Cover. Jake could see daylight filtering through cracks in the wooden boards, which meant they were only inches away from the surface in safety. But the sounds of pursuit from below were getting closer, and someone was definitely tampering with the elevator mechanism in an attempt to trap them in the shaft. With Elena unconscious in his arms and armed traffickers ascending from below, Jake reached up and began pushing against the wooden cover with both hands. The boards were heavy and had been sealed against weather, but desperation gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. The cover began to move, snow falling through the opening as daylight flooded the shaft. Jake could hear the storm still raging above, but even a blizzard was preferable to the deadly trap they were escaping from underground. One final push sent the cover flying open, and Jake lifted Elena's unconscious form toward the surface opening. That's when the first gunshot echoed through the shaft, the bullet ricocheting off stone walls just inches from Jake's head. Traffickers had reached the elevator mechanism and were now shooting upward, trying to kill both witnesses before they could escape to the surface. Jake hauled Elena through the opening and rolled both of them away from the shaft entrance, just as more gunshots erupted from below. They were on the surface, alive, but Elena was in critical condition and armed criminals were still trapped in the mine system beneath them. Jake emerged from the mine shaft into a world transformed by the continuing blizzard, carrying Elena's unconscious form through snow that reached his waist and wind that threatened to knock him off his feet. The secondary shaft had brought them to the surface nearly half a mile from where Sheriff Sandoval was waiting at the main entrance, and Jake had no way to signal their location through the howling storm. Elena's breathing was becoming increasingly shallow and irregular, her diabetic condition reaching a critical stage that would require immediate medical intervention if she was going to survive the next hour. The landscape around the mine shaft was completely unfamiliar. Jake's usual landmarks were obscured by the blizzard, and the GPS unit in his rescue kit was having difficulty maintaining satellite contact through the heavy cloud cover. He wrapped Elena in emergency blankets from his pack and activated a chemical heat source, trying to stabilize her body temperature while he figured out how to get her to medical help. The storm was so severe that helicopter evacuation would be impossible, and ground transportation would require reaching one of the main access roads that might still be passable for emergency vehicles. That's when Jake heard the sound of engines starting up from the direction of the main mining complex. The traffickers had apparently given up their pursuit through the mine system and were now mobilizing their surface vehicles to hunt down the escaped witnesses. Jake could see headlights moving through the storm, searching in a pattern that suggested they knew the general area where he and Elena had emerged from the underground system. The criminals had the advantage of numbers and mobility, but Jake had intimate knowledge of the terrain and years of experience moving through the high desert. In extreme weather conditions, Jake activated his emergency radio beacon, hoping that Sheriff Sandoval or other rescue personnel would be able to track the signal even through the storm interference. Elena stirred slightly at the sound of the radio, her eyes opening briefly, before rolling back as her body continued to fight the effects of prolonged insulin deprivation. "Hang on, Elena," Jake whispered, adjusting her blankets and checking her pulse. Your sister is waiting for you, and we're not giving up now. The girl's lips moved as if she was trying to speak, but no sound emerged. The headlights were getting closer, and Jake realized he needed to find shelter and concealment before the traffickers located them in the open terrain around the mine shaft. He spotted a cluster of large boulders about 200 yards away that would provide both protection from the wind and a defensive position if the criminals found them. Carrying Elena through the deep snow was exhausting work, but Jake's years of conditioning and his determination to honor the promise he'd made to Maria Santos drove him forward despite the brutal conditions. As Jake reached the boulder formation, his radio crackled with an incoming transmission. Jake, this is Miguel. I've got your beacon signal, and I'm coordinating with state police for emergency medical evacuation. There's an ambulance crew standing by at the highway junction, but we need to get Elena to a pickup point where they can reach her. Can you make it to the old Forest Service Road, about a mile north of your current position? Jake checked his GPS and calculated the route through the storm. It would be difficult but possible, assuming the traffickers didn't intercept them first. Miguel, we've got bigger problems, Jake responded. The trafficking operation has mobilized multiple vehicles, and they're actively hunting us. These people are armed and desperate, and they're not going to let us walk out of here with a witness who can identify their operation. I need backup, and I need it fast. The radio was quiet for several moments before Sandoval's voice returned, tense with urgency. State Police Tactical Team is en route, but they're still 20 minutes out in these conditions. FBI agents from Albuquerque are coming, but they're even further away. You need to stay hidden and stay alive until we can get you support, Jake. There's something else you need to know. We've been monitoring radio communications from the trafficking network, and they've called for additional personnel from their operations in Colorado and Arizona. This isn't just about eliminating witnesses anymore. They're treating this as a full-scale war to protect their entire Southwest operation. The implications were staggering. What had started as a rescue mission had escalated into a confrontation with a major criminal organization that was willing to commit multiple murders to protect their human trafficking network. Elena's condition continued to deteriorate, and Jake realized that waiting for backup might mean losing her to diabetic shock even if they managed to avoid the armed traffickers who were searching for them. He made the decision to attempt reaching the Forest Service Road, using his knowledge of the terrain to avoid the most likely routes that their pursuers would take. Jake fashioned a crude sled from his emergency supplies and Elena's blankets, allowing him to transport her more efficiently through the deep snow while keeping his hands free for navigation and potential self-defense. The journey through the storm was a nightmare of blowing snow, sub-zero temperatures, and constant fear of discovery by the criminals who were systematically searching the area. Jake used every skill his Comanche ancestors had passed down, reading wind patterns to mask their scent, using terrain features to avoid detection, and moving with the patient silence of a hunter who understood that survival often depended on invisibility. Elena remained unconscious but alive, her breathing stabilized by the emergency medical supplies Jake had administered. Halfway to the rendezvous point, Jake's worst fears were realized. The sound of snowmobiles cut through the storm, their engines indicating that the traffickers had switched to vehicles better suited for the extreme weather conditions. Snowmobiles could travel faster than a man on foot through deep snow, and they could access terrain that would be impossible for trucks or SUVs. Jake pulled Elena's sled behind a fallen tree and waited, hoping the searchers would pass without detecting them. The sound of engines grew louder, then began to fade as the snowmobiles continued their patrol pattern, but Jake's relief was short-lived. One of the snowmobiles had stopped nearby, its engine idling while the rider apparently investigated something he'd seen in the snow. Jake could hear boots crunching through the drifts, getting closer to their hiding place. He drew the survival knife from his rescue kit, inadequate against firearms, but better than nothing if it came to hand combat. The footsteps were almost on top of them when Elena chose that moment to regain consciousness, moaning softly as her body fought the effects of diabetic ketoacidosis. The sound was quiet, barely audible over the wind, but it was enough. "Over here!" the searchers shouted in Spanish. "I found them." Jake heard the snowmobile engine rev as the rider called for backup, and within seconds, the area was swarming with armed men who had converged on their location. Jake found himself surrounded by 3 traffickers carrying assault rifles, their faces hidden behind ski masks and winter gear. The leader, recognizable by his height and the scar on his cheek that Maria had described, stepped forward with his weapon trained on Jake's chest. "You have caused us considerable trouble, Mr. Crowfeather," the man said in heavily accented English, apparently having identified Jake through some intelligence network. "This operation has been running successfully for 2 years, and now we must abandon millions of dollars in infrastructure because of your interference. That kind of disruption requires compensation." Jake kept his hands visible and tried to position himself between the gunman and Elena's unconscious form. "The girl needs medical attention," he said. "She's diabetic and should die without insulin. Whatever you're planning to do with us, at least let her live. She's just a teenager who was looking for work to help her family." The scarred leader laughed coldly. "You think we care about one girl when our entire Southwest operation is at risk? Elena Santos has seen too much, just like her sister and just like you. Dead witnesses tell no stories." But before the trafficker could give the order to fire, the sound of helicopter rotors cut through the storm. Jake looked up to see a New Mexico State Police helicopter emerging from the snow clouds, its searchlights cutting through the blizzard to illuminate the group of armed men surrounding him and Elena. "This is New Mexico State Police," a voice boomed from the helicopter's loudspeaker. "You are surrounded by law enforcement personnel. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." The traffickers looked around desperately, realizing that their snowmobiles offered no protection against airborne law enforcement and that the approaching helicopter probably meant ground units were close behind. The scarred leader's face twisted with rage as he understood that his carefully planned operation was collapsing around him. "If we're going down," he snarled, "we're taking these witnesses with us." But before he could raise his weapon, Jake launched himself forward in a desperate tackle that sent both men tumbling into the snow. The assault rifle went flying as they struggled, and Jake used every fighting technique he'd learned during his military service and search and rescue training. The other traffickers were momentarily confused by the sudden violence, and their hesitation gave the state police helicopter crew the opening they needed to engage with precise sniper fire that neutralized the immediate threat. The battle was over within minutes, but it felt like hours to Jake as he fought for his life and Elena's survival in the swirling snow. When the shooting stopped, 2 traffickers were dead, one was wounded and in custody, and the scarred leader was unconscious from the head injury he'd sustained when Jake slammed him into a boulder during their struggle. Jake immediately turned his attention to Elena, whose condition had worsened during the confrontation. She was barely breathing. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that indicated severe diabetic shock, and her pulse was becoming increasingly irregular. The state police helicopter had landed nearby, and paramedics were already rushing toward Elena with emergency medical equipment. Jake watched as they quickly established in 4-line and began administering the insulin and glucose solutions that would hopefully reverse her diabetic crisis. "She's in severe ketoacidosis," one paramedic reported. "Blood sugar levels are off. The charts in her electrolyte balance is completely disrupted. We need to get her to a trauma center immediately." The helicopter crew was already preparing Elena for emergency transport, working with the efficiency that came from years of handling critical mountain rescues. Sheriff Sandoval arrived 20 minutes later with a convoy of state police vehicles and FBI agents, their four-wheel drive truck somehow managing to navigate the treacherous mountain roads despite the continuing blizzard. The scene that greeted them was like something from a war zone. Dead and wounded criminals scattered across the snow, abandoned snowmobiles and weapons, and the evidence of a trafficking operation that had been using the remote mining district for activities that went far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. "Jake," Sandoval said, clasping him on the shoulder, "you did good work here, but this is bigger than any of us realized. The FBI has been tracking this network for months, and your rescue operation just handed them the break they've been looking for." Agent Rebecca Morrison from the FBI's Albuquerque field office approached Jake as crime scene technicians began processing evidence from the confrontation. She was a tall woman in her 40s with the kind of professional competence that came from years of investigating complex criminal organizations. "Mr. Crowfeather, what you've uncovered here is going to help us shut down human trafficking operations across the entire Southwest. The man you captured, Carlos Vega, is a high-ranking member of an international syndicate that's been using remote mining areas to process victims before transporting them to major cities for sale. The evidence we're collecting from their base camp includes records of over 100 victims who passed through this location during the past 2 years." Jake felt sick as he contemplated the scope of the criminal enterprise that had been operating in his beloved mountains. What happened to those victims? He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Some were sold into forced labor in agricultural operations throughout the West. Agent Morrison replied grimly. Others were transported to urban areas for prostitution or domestic servitude. A few managed to escape, but most disappeared into a system designed to make them invisible to law enforcement and social services. Your actions today have saved not just Elena Santos, but potentially dozens of future victims who won't be processed through this operation. The knowledge that his intervention had prevented additional crimes provided some comfort, but Jake couldn't stop thinking about the victims who hadn't been rescued. 3 hours later, Jake found himself back at Espanola Regional Medical Center, where Dr. Reyes was providing updates on both Santos sisters. Maria had recovered sufficiently from her hypothermia to be discharged into protective custody, while Elena was in the intensive care unit receiving treatment for severe diabetic ketoacidosis. "She's responding to treatment," Dr. Reyes reported. "Her blood sugar levels are stabilizing and her kidney function is improving. She needs several days of intensive care, but I'm optimistic about her recovery. Without your quick thinking with the emergency glucose supplies, she probably wouldn't have survived long enough for us to treat her. You saved her life, Mr. Crowfeather." Jake sat in the hospital waiting room, still wearing his snow-covered rescue gear and feeling the exhaustion that came after an adrenaline-fueled crisis. Maria Santos approached him, walking slowly but steadily, her face bearing the marks of her ordeal but her eyes bright with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said simply. "You brought my sister home when everyone else said it was impossible. You risked your life for people you'd never met, and you kept the promise you made to save Elena. My family will never forget what you did for us." Jake was quiet for several moments, thinking about the events of the past few days, and the way a simple rescue had expanded into something much larger. "Your sister saved herself by staying strong enough to survive until we could find her," he replied. "And you saved her by refusing to give up hope even when the doctors thought you were hallucinating. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is believe that the people we love are worth fighting for." Maria wiped tears from her eyes and nodded, understanding the deeper truth in Jake's words. 6 months later, Jake received an invitation that brought the story full circle. Elena Santos was graduating from high school, having completed her education despite the trauma she'd endured, and the family wanted him to attend the ceremony. The trafficking network that had operated in the mining district had been completely dismantled, with convictions secured against 15 individuals and a broader investigation that had led to arrests in 6 states. The old mine shafts had been permanently sealed by the Forest Service, ensuring that they could never again be used for criminal purposes. At Elena's graduation, Jake met her extended family parents, grandparents, cousins, and siblings who had traveled from throughout the Southwest to celebrate her achievement. Elena herself had grown stronger and more confident, though she still carried the quiet strength that had enabled her to survive her underground ordeal. "I'm studying criminal justice in college," she told Jake as they talked after the ceremony. "I want to help other victims of trafficking, to make sure that what happened to Maria and me doesn't happen to other families. Your example showed me that one person can make a difference when they're willing to act on their principles." Jake felt a deep satisfaction knowing that Elena had transformed her traumatic experience into motivation for helping others. The mountains around Esperanza had been cleansed of the criminal enterprise that had corrupted them, and the isolation that had once hidden predators was now protecting the wildlife and natural beauty that made the high desert so precious to those who understood its value. As Jake drove home through those same mountains on a clear summer evening, he reflected on the way a simple decision to stop and investigate suspicious snow had led to events that changed multiple lives and exposed a criminal network that had operated in shadows for years. His Comanche ancestors had always taught that the land itself would provide guidance to those who listened carefully and acted with courage when action was required. Sometimes the most important discoveries weren't the ones you were looking for. Sometimes they were the ones that found you when you were brave enough to investigate the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. 2 years after the rescue at the San Miguel mine, Jake Crowfeather stood on the ridge overlooking his property as the first snow of winter began to fall across the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The Weather Service was predicting another major storm, but this time Jake felt only the familiar excitement that came with the changing seasons rather than the dread he'd experienced during those terrible February days when everything had changed. The scars from that ordeal had healed, but the lessons learned and connections forged would last a lifetime. The old Esperanza mining complex had been transformed into something completely different under the oversight of federal and state agencies. The Bureau of Land Management had sealed all the dangerous mine shafts permanently, using modern engineering techniques to ensure that the underground passages could never again be used to hide criminal activities or endanger the lives of curious explorers. The surface buildings had been demolished except for one structure that now served as a memorial to the victims of human trafficking, with plaques honoring both those who had been saved and those who had not been found in time. Jake's reputation as a tracker and search and rescue specialist had grown significantly following the Santos case, and he now consulted with law enforcement agencies throughout the Southwest on cases involving missing persons and human trafficking operations. The FBI had retained him as a contractor, sending him to investigate suspicious activities in remote areas where his unique combination of traditional tracking skills and modern rescue techniques proved invaluable. But Jake had been careful to maintain his connection to the land and his commitment to the community that had shaped him. Sheriff Miguel Sandoval had been re-elected by the largest margin in county history, his handling of the trafficking case having demonstrated a level of competence and dedication that impressed even his most vocal critics. The partnership between Jake and the Sheriff's Department had become a model for other rural law enforcement agencies dealing with similar challenges in isolated terrain. Sandoval had also established a new position within his department, specifically focused on human trafficking awareness and prevention, funded by federal grants that recognized the county's innovative approach to combating these crimes. Dr. Amanda Reyes had completed her residency and accepted a permanent position at Espanola Regional Medical Center, where she developed specialized protocols for treating victims of extreme weather exposure and trauma. Her experience with the Santos sisters had led to research collaborations with medical schools throughout the region, and she'd become a recognized expert in wilderness medicine and emergency hypothermia treatment. The hospital had also established a victim services program that provided comprehensive support for survivors of human trafficking and other violent crimes. But it was the Santos family that represented the most remarkable transformation in the aftermath of the rescue operation. Maria Santos had completed her recovery from hypothermia and post-traumatic stress with the help of counseling services provided by federal victim assistance programs. She'd relocated to Albuquerque, where she worked as a victim advocate for an organization that assisted immigrants and trafficking survivors. Her fluency in both Spanish and English, combined with her personal experience, made her uniquely qualified to help others navigate the complex process of recovery and legal proceedings. Elena Santos had not only graduated from high school, but had been accepted to the University of New Mexico on a full scholarship, where she was pursuing a double major in criminal justice and social work. Her academic performance had been exceptional, but more importantly, she'd become a powerful advocate for trafficking victims and had testified before the state legislature about the need for enhanced victim services and prevention programs. Elena's transformation from victim to advocate had inspired legislation that improved funding for rural law enforcement and created new resources for at-risk populations. The broader investigation that began with Elena's rescue had ultimately led to the dismantling of trafficking networks across 7 states, resulting in over 40 convictions and the rescue of more than 200 victims who had been trapped in various forms of forced labor and sexual exploitation. Agent Rebecca Morrison had received a promotion to head the FBI's Southwest Human Trafficking Task Force, and the investigative techniques developed during the Santos case had become standard protocols for similar operations throughout the region. Jake had received numerous awards and commendations for his role in the rescue, but the recognition that meant the most to him came from an unexpected source. The Comanche Nation had honored him with a traditional ceremony that acknowledged his use of ancestral skills in service of justice and protection of the innocent. His grandmother's teachings about reading the land and understanding the connections between all living things had proven their worth in the modern world, bridging the gap between traditional knowledge and contemporary challenges on this snowy evening. As Jake prepared his property for another winter storm, he reflected on the way a single decision to investigate suspicious signs in the snow had led to consequences he never could have imagined. The tire tracks he'd found on his land that February morning had been the first evidence of a criminal enterprise that had operated in shadows for years, preying on vulnerable people who had nowhere else to turn for help. By choosing to follow those tracks instead of ignoring them, Jake had set in motion events that had saved lives and brought justice to those who had thought themselves beyond the reach of the law. His phone buzzed with a text message from Elena Santos, who was now in her sophomore year at the university. The message contained a photo of her latest academic achievement, Dean's List recognition for maintaining a perfect grade point average while working part-time at a legal aid clinic that served immigrant communities. The accompanying text was simple but profound. "Thank you for teaching me that one person really can make a difference when they refuse to give up on what's right. Jake, you showed me that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about being afraid but choosing to act anyway because someone needs help." Jake smiled as he read Elena's words, remembering the terrified teenager he'd found in the underground chamber and marveling at the strong, confident young woman she'd become. Her transformation embodied everything he believed about the human capacity for healing and growth, when given the support and opportunity to flourish. As the snow continued to fall across the high desert landscape that had been home to his family for generations, Jake felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that the mountains were once again a place of beauty and sanctuary, rather than a hunting ground for predators. The old mine shafts were sealed, the criminal networks were broken, And families like the Santos sisters had been given the chance to build new lives free from fear and exploitation. Sometimes the most important victories were the ones that prevented future tragedies, ensuring that other families would never have to endure the terror and separation that Maria and Elena had survived. The storm was approaching, but Jake was ready for it, just as he was ready for whatever challenges the future might bring to his beloved high desert home.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.